Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Cam. For this episode, my interview guest is known as the Doctor of Digital and is the author of the fictional book Burning America in the Best Interest of the Children. On April 26th, his book about the rock singer Ian Hunter, titled Ian Hunter, Every Album, Every Song, will be released. His name is Mick Smith, and here's my interview with Mick. Dr. Mick Smith, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I have an interest in ancient things, and that's a great name. So I got to give you kudos for that.
How did you become known as the Doctor of Digital?
That's a good question. So I tell everybody I'm a recovering academic. So I've been in academia for a very long time, and that's the doctor part. But I've also noticed that with the internet and all things that have moved online, everything is digital. Hence, the Doctor of Digital.
Feel free to further introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. So what I've done probably more recently, since I'm a recovering academic, is I'm still teaching and hopefully inspiring people, but I'm writing more popular books and also podcasting. So I still feel as though I am teaching and I'm still doing the things that I did, except it's more for myself at this point, with a couple of books out and some more projects, a screenplay, things of that nature. But I'm also very interested in helping people. But it's just, I'd say, I've shifted from a formal institutional setting to more informal. So I do a lot of consulting as well, too. I consult on educational technology, custom software, and people that are interested in those things that I had spent a long time and many decades in that field.
Without spoiling too much about your book, Burning America in the Best Interest of the Children, what is your book about?
Yeah, so there's two of them that are out so far, Burning America in the Best Interest of the Children and On Track Ian Hunter. The Burning America volume really came out of some things that, well, if you're writing fiction, a lot of writers of fiction will say, there is a certain amount of the material which is real and actually happened. And that's exactly what I would say Burning America is about. So I went through a situation which was very traumatic, and that is I pulled up in my driveway the one day and everything was gone. So the house was entirely stripped. I called the banks, bank accounts emptied, all of which I said, sort of philosophically, it's just stuff, and you can get all that stuff back. Unfortunately, our 5-year-old daughter was not in the home. And I said, well, that's uncalled for because I need to track down that child. I cannot replace a child. So what I did was I started trying to find out where she had been. She had been at some friend's house and I didn't know exactly where. We were living in Pennsylvania, but tracked down a police officer to try to get her back into the home. And over the police radio, when the police called the neighbor to find out where our daughter had been earlier, found out she was in California, so 3,000 miles away. And I said to myself, Self, you got a problem. And what happened was that my spouse, my wife, had taken off with our child, and I needed to go back. And so the novel is really written about a person who was thrown into the family court system, which I call an industry, not knowing really how to get through or how to navigate. And the novel is really written about the 3.5 years that it took to get my daughter returned back to the marital home and that situations that unfolded. So very interesting question about that, because when I would give it to the publisher and the text editor was reading it and she was saying things like, well, this is not what's supposed to happen. I go, I know that. So that's what gave it the idea of having a story. So there are a lot of twists and turns. And so, like you say, I don't want to give away the entire story, but I think it's a good story in the sense that there are a lot of surprises, a lot of things that you don't expect, and like a lot of good stories, there's also a surprise ending as well.
What made you choose the title Burning America for your book?
Yep. So what I had thought at the time was, since I am a very patriotic American, I'm very interested in helping my country get better. I wanted to write something to say this is a huge problem. So everyone knows the cliche and has heard it, the children are our future. So I agree with that. But I also found within the family court system, which is an industry which a lot of people profit from, that's not what is actually happening. And that explains the subtitle, like what's in the best interest of the children with a question mark. So I'm initially thinking about America because it's an American problem. However, since the novel has been out, and also I started a podcast on a related theme of that, I found out that it is more of a global problem as well, too. So there is the epidemic of custody, divorce, and healing. And so my second podcast is really on that theme. So what I've really discovered is that for many people in many parts of the world as well, not only in America, but in the world as well, this is a real issue. So having talked to experts and others in Australia and England and some other places as well, we find out that, yeah, this is something that we really need to address. It's a serious issue, not only in America, but that was my initial concern.
Yeah, and I'm going to give some of my thoughts about family law in this country. Now, I'm coming from a different political ideology than you are, but there are some situations where you have like a biological uh, parent uh, who is simply not uh, functionally able to care for their child through normal parenting means. Although I always do have concerns about people who pretend to act in good faith with the family court system and try to either and try to like profit off of a rather complex and not easy to understand system.
Yeah, and I think what I've found out is that there are some reasons that why a person would take off. Let's say if there is a case of abuse in some form, physical or mental. But here's a situation that I found myself in, and others do, that, well, we really didn't do anything wrong. It's just that the other person may not be mentally or physically able to parent. So I'm almost agreeing with you to say yes, but it's very difficult to determine how that is. Now, to me, it was kind of obvious. And again, reading the novel, the real stuff that happened, there are a number of situations that for a person who is reasonable, we'd say there's probably something wrong and psychologically bothering this person who took off, that is a spouse. And so you go through the family court system, and there are these highly trained individuals from Ivy League colleges who then analyze you and went through that process a couple times, and they didn't pick up on anything. And I'm thinking to myself, well, here's a handwritten note by this individual who talked about their family difficulties with their mother and their family. Wouldn't that suggest to you that there is something wrong? I mean, I'm not kidding you, but there I found within the psychiatrist's analysis, don't leave the child alone that often. I'm thinking to myself, I'm almost shocked. What do you mean? My child is being left alone? Well, where is the mother? Why is she leaving the child alone? Not even suggesting the fact that maybe this is a person who is not parenting in a proper fashion. In fact, the psychiatrist, who in one evaluation said, when the child is being left alone and she feels scared, she should go out of the apartment and look for help. Thinking to myself, you're telling a 5 or 6 year old child to just wander the streets looking for help? So when I went through this process, I said, look, this seems to me totally out of control. And I don't think this is a really a fair evaluation and helpful for the child. And if you look at the cover of the novel, you'll actually see a picture which worked against me. The child was asked at one time during the evaluation process, where do you feel most safe and where do you feel most comfortable? And the child draws a picture and it shows the dad holding the child as a baby. Person has a beard. Obviously, this is a man. And in fact, the psychiatrist said, no, that child is too close to the father. I'm thinking to myself, well, what do you mean? Isn't that what a parent is supposed to do? You're supposed to love your children. You're supposed to care for them. So it's a very unusual process, and it's something that really doesn't work. I'd say it's a broken system. And that's really what I was trying to get across in the novel. So I sat on it for a long time. I really published it for myself, that is, to try to work through catharsis and trying to get myself healthy again. 20 years later, lo and behold, same thing happened to my best friend living in California. Spouse took off with their child, took their child 3,000 miles away. I dusted off the text and I said, I need to publish this. This is way too common. This should not be happening in America.
Yeah, anytime family law courts need to get involved with in a particular case, it's usually something dramatic or something. I am glad I don't have any kids because uh, I would not be physically able to care for a child. And usually, another point I'm going to make: children are more often than not the best judge of what family situation is best for them.
Yeah, and that's my point about asking a young child, because you can't really ask a child to choose between a mother and a father. The child is going to say, well, they love both mom and dad. And I get that. That makes total sense. But when you ask a young child to draw a picture in the example I gave, well, the child is telling you it. And I think, well, wouldn't a person who is trained by the courts and does this all the time, wouldn't that suggest that the child is simply trying to draw a picture of where they feel most close and most loved? The child knows. I mean, because they're too innocent of trying to pick when a choice when they're older, perhaps. If they're a teenager, well, there's probably a little bit more manipulation going around because that's the teenager's job, to annoy you and to push the limits. We know that's the job description. But you ask a young child at 5 or 6 year old, which our child was at the time, to simply draw a picture, and the child was being honest. And that sort of honesty worked against what the psychiatrist had in mind, which was already predetermined. And that's what I said was so frustrating about being in this system. I stayed in marital home the whole time. And I think to myself, well, I'm the person who has the stability, right? I'm a person who didn't fool around, didn't go anywhere, doesn't have a drug or alcohol problem. Or wouldn't I be the stable parent here? Courts don't necessarily see it that way.
Yeah, when I was a child, I was always closer to my mother than my father, and your child was probably seen as closer to you than her mother, and that happens.
Yeah, there's a reason for it. I mean, again, when I said about the academic part of my life, see, I had a very flexible schedule as an academic, so I wasn't in a traditional job between 8 or 9 o'clock till 5 o'clock. I was often just at home because I only had to teach classes. I only went into work to teach those classes. And when we were very young parents, my wife had worked two jobs, or two back-to-back jobs. So she was working double shifts because my job hadn't started. So when the child was a baby, guess it was primary caregiver. It's just what the family needed. So I was the one who was with the baby when she was 10 weeks old until she was about 9 or 10 months old. I was the one who saw her walk for the first time and crawl, and I fed her, put her to bed, changed her diapers. I was the primary caregiver. So not surprisingly, the child also was using the first words that were spoken were not mom, or it was actually dad. So it made a whole lot more sense that this is where the child felt most comfortable. So this was frustrating. And also, the Supreme Court had actually ruled on this. There had been a doctrine called the tender years doctrine, which meant that most children, because they are close to their mom, especially when they're babies, the Supreme Court's ruled you can't use that as a criteria. So it's not simply the age. So they did away with the tender years doctrine because sometimes the child feels closer to the man or the father. In my case, in our case, that's what happened. Didn't matter. And that's what, again, say it's so frustrating about the family court system. In fact, when I had a podcast, my co-hosts and I have experienced very similar situation, despite the fact that one is a man, one is a woman, one's a husband, one was a wife, and yet she experienced the same thing. So when we talk to experts, the experts have told us that, in fact, they can take the same exact set of facts to Judge A, and Judge A rules one way. Take those same set of facts to Judge B, Judge B rules the opposite. And I'm thinking to myself, well, then that makes no sense whatsoever. It's not really based on any sort of rational idea, factual information, and it's sort of arbitrary. And that's really unfair for the family. It's unfair for the child or the children.
You have a book that's slated to be released on April 26th, titled On Track Ian Hunter, Every Album, Every Song. Without spoiling too much of that book, what will it be about?
That actually is my favorite songwriter. It's a person by the name of Ian Hunter, and he had been in the legendary Mott the Hoople band from England, and that was a band that was around from 1969 till 1974 or so. Ian Hunter went on to a solo career in 1975, and what On Track does is examines every single solo song that he has written since 1975. Now, he continues to release albums. He's going to come out with one very soon. He's actually got part one, Defiance, that was released last year. Part two, Defiance, is coming out this year. He's also got in the studio a lot of work for part three, Defiance. Now, you might even say, well, how does this guy keep on going? Well, he's only 84 years young and he's got a long way to go. So it's a very interesting artist. And I'd say, without giving it too much, I think that if you're a fan of Ian Hunter or Mott the Hoople, if you're a classic rock fan or a general music fan, and you just want to appreciate good, solid songwriting, I think Ian Hunter is really the ticket for you. And it's sort of a companion piece. You can listen to his music, look at the songs, and I explain them, and I tell you something about them.
Now, are your books self-published, traditionally published, published by a hybrid press, or did you use different publishing methods for each of your books?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it took looking at the general publishing area at this point, I think it's a very exciting time to be in publishing because there's a lot more options. So initially, when I had the Burning America novel, I had thought about going with a traditional publisher, and that's why I said I had sat on it for a long time. Didn't really get anywhere. In fact, I had a very unusual rejection letter. Just one rejection letter from a traditional publisher said, you know, this novel is written so clearly and so realistically, you would think these are real people. I thought, well, okay, wouldn't that mean you should publish it because it's good? And actually, they turned it down. So I said maybe traditional publishing is not the way to go with that particular project. So I used a hybrid publisher for that one. And then for the On Track Ian Hunter volume, I did go to a publisher of music who has been in business for quite a long time. And this is exactly what they do. It's a music niche. And what they are really concentrating on the On Track series, which is a part of what Ian Hunter book is about. It's on a lot of artists and bands that had been around back in the day and also probably 70s, 80s, 90s. So it's sort of a traditional publisher with a niche. And I think that's why he was very ideal individual to work with. And that publisher, I think, it was very good and satisfying relationship. But it's a very exciting time to be publishing. I hope people are just publishing more books.
How do your musical tastes influence who you are?
I think that goes back to saying why I would even bother to write a book about Ian Hunter. So it was the first rock concert I went to. So I was a 15-year-old kid. A buddy of mine had a license. He was 16, had a car. I was living in Southern California at the time, and I had heard of Mott the Hoople. Some of the songs had been on the radio. And he said, hey, would you like to go? And of course, I can't drive, so I don't have a car. I got a ride. So got a ride to Hollywood and saw Ian Hunter on September 14th, 1973, is the lead singer of Mott the Hoople at the Hollywood Palladium. And it's one of those things, my gosh, this has like changed my life. I saw the power and the majesty of rock and roll. It was the first real rock concert that I had ever attended. And so I became an instant fan. I started looking into all the music that Mott the Hoople had released and also Ian Hunter. He had written some things previous to the band. And then also, this is something which has accompanied my life in a lot of ways. So very fortunate to have had contact with Ian. And I asked him when I was publishing the novel, for example, I said, some of these songs, it's kind of like the soundtrack of my life. I really relate to some of the things that you are saying in your music. Could I use some of the lyrics in my novel? Who would I ask? And he responded and he said, well, I guess that's me. Yeah, go ahead. So some of the Ian Hunter lyrics are actually in the novel as well. So when publishing Ian Hunter On Track, I was thinking of a lot of these things because I've been a lifelong fan. And I'd say, okay, to write this book, it's taking me 50 years and 9 months. And what I mean by that is I've been listening to his music for 50 years, and it took about actually 9 months to write. And things that I was curious about and things I had looked up over the years, it gave me an opportunity to actually help other people understand some of the lyrics and the references that he makes, because he makes a lot of them, cultural, popular culture, political references, and all kinds of things. He's obviously a well-read individual and he's a thinking person, and that's reflected in his lyrics.
I noticed when we were setting up this interview, you had the Clinton Cash book about the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton family corruption over many years in the background. And I also read on your matchmaker.fm page that you've described the Reagan Revolution, which ushered in a major conservative shift in American politics in the 1980s, as too little too late. Given that a lot of Republican politicians idolize Reagan, why do you believe that the Reagan Revolution was too little too late?
Well, that'll give you an idea for an upcoming book that I'm writing. So I'm sending it out to publishers now, and that's in the process of seeing if I can find a publisher for it, because it's a book on recent American history. So when I was teaching, these are some of the things that I would discuss with my students. So in some ways, I'm kind of outside the two-party system. So I'm neither a Republican nor a Democrat, and I've actually been a registered member of not only two political parties, but actually three. So it's got to get people guessing. So where does this guy stand politically? Well, it goes back to my image of I think the country has got some serious issues and some serious problems. And having lived through the 1960s and the 1970s when I was growing up, and then obviously through the Reagan era of 1980s, I'm going to make the argument that the Reagan Revolution was too little too late because of what has happened since then. For example, who has really risen forward to move this country in a better direction as Reagan did? Because the collapsing Soviet empire, are we now stronger economically than we were during the Reagan era? Are we safer than we were during the Reagan era? And my point here is that although a lot of younger people at the time were enthused by Reagan, and there was a sort of conservative revolution, especially with Gingrich in 1994, but what has happened since then? Now the country, I would argue, is at its weakest point in terms of security, and the economy is not strong. So I think he is too little too late. Think we need to rethink many of the issues that are concerning Americans and explaining some of the things that people are very disturbed by. That is, why is inflation so high? Why are we spending a lot of money on overseas adventures, and yet the American people are sort of crying out, like, well, what about our infrastructure? What about our economy? What about ourselves? It's sort of the kitchen table issues. And that's what I'm trying to argue. I think that for all the people that were so excited by Reagan, and I do admire Ronald Reagan, nobody has risen to the fore to make America stronger, more powerful, more secure.
Dr. Smith, thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. You were an interesting guest.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you saying that and the kind words. So I definitely would like to try to help you and your podcast. If there's things that I can do for you and your listeners, please let me know. I'm always available. I'd like to help people and yourself.
I wish Mick well with this upcoming book that will be released later this week. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding you all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@Apollo Papyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.